Welcome to our presentation about the Historic Preservation Program in the Marshall Islands, a group of 34 coral atolls and islands about 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. The idea of formal cultural preservation set its roots here as far back as 1966, with the formation of the Marshall Islands Museum Committee. This group later incorporated into the Museum of the Marshall Islands and struggled for nearly a decade to raise the funds for the current museum library structure. Additional funding for the complex, which was constructed in 1973, was provided by the Trust Territory Grant and Aid Program and a Library Services Grant. The library began functioning in 1974 under the direction of librarian Tamara Jordan. The next major step forward occurred in 1980 under the leadership and lobbying efforts of Carmen Bigler, chairman of the museum's Board of Trustees. That year, the Nitagella, the National Parliament, appropriated funds to construct display cases for the museum and support training for a full-time curator for the new building. When the museum first opened its doors to the public amid island-wide festivities, that a contest was held to name the institution. The term Alele was chosen. The Alele is a finely plated basket used in times past by Marshall Islanders to store valuable personal items. In 1981, the Alele was a beneficiary of over 2,000 artifacts repatriated from a Bishop Museum archaeological survey, which had been conducted in 1977 with funding provided by the Trust Territory Historic Preservation Program. During the following year, Alele would take its first big step forward and begin administering a series of contracts with this agency to coordinate the Historic Preservation Program for the Marshall Islands and implement important projects in the area of cultural preservation. This partnership between Alele and the Historic Preservation Program, funded by the U.S. National Park Service, would again and again prove successful in merging funds from a variety of public and private sources to further the cultural preservation goals of our nation. One of our first and currently ongoing endeavors has been to document oral histories related to properties of historic and cultural significance. Since 1983, over 700 historic sites have been identified through field research and interviews with older people. Alele staff, Kaneki Amach and Longerbo Frank, have recorded nearly 100 hours of such oral literature, which is being carefully preserved under proper environmental conditions for future generations. In addition, the museum is looking for information about whaling shipwrecks, World War II sites, and other significant properties of more recent origin. Throughout the decade, Alele has expanded its video project to include the filming of traditional and contemporary expressions of music and dance. It has become one of the most popular programs in the museum, stimulating strong community participation and involvement. From the hundreds of hours of tapes, Alele staff edit programs which are provided to the Ministry of Education for use in the schools, are played in the museum gallery, and are available for sale and rental to the public. There is rarely a time when the museum's TV is not playing videos of a cultural event for a captivated audience of young people. Such programs remind them of the unique aspects of their culture and the importance of conserving and enhancing their cultural attributes. Stories by orators, contemporary local music and dance, and commentary by staff historian Kaneki Amach are blended into exciting and popular weekly radio and television shows. The radio program began in 1981. The TV program had its beginnings in early 1986. Now with over 200 one-hour Alele programs in its archives, Marshall's Educational Television, the newest division of Alele, is broadcasting one of these cultural programs nightly on METV Channel 4. By providing recognition and developing a positive image of Marshall Islands culture, these broadcasts aid the museum's efforts in locating orators with knowledge and information about heretofore unknown historic sites and stories. Stabilization and restoration of the historic Joachim de Broom House on Likiep Atoll in the northern Marshall Islands was a more classic example of the historic preservation activity which began in 1984. Although lack of funds prevented Alele from completing all the work required to restore the house back to its original state, a great deal of progress was made during 1984 and 1985. Since then, we have been concentrating on preserving hundreds of books, documents, and more than 2,000 glass plate negatives recovered from the house. The documents, and particularly the photographs, are among the few existing documents on the Marshall Islands from the late 1800s to the late 1920s, providing an unparalleled view of the island's history and culture. The historical photographs are featured in the museum gallery exhibitions and on Alele's weekly television program, where viewers frequently see pictures of their ancestors for the first time. During 1984 and 1985, Alele sent out a team to Lukeyup to carry out restoration of the De Broom home and related structures, which were in desperate need of repair. With historic preservation development funding and additional support from the Private Industry Council, a carpentry training program consisting of a group of 6 young Islander trainees were assisted and trained by Alele staff during the restoration and stabilization effort. The carpenters successfully re-roofed and re-sided the storage building for De Broom's shipwright tools, repaired the cistern housing, constructed new bookcases, painted interior walls and ceilings, installed a new stairway, replaced parlor and bedroom doors, treated the underside of the house and replaced floor planks, then sanded, varnished, and stained the floors. During the restorations, hundreds of documents and more than 2,000 glass plate negatives were located. They were found to be in very tenuous environmental conditions from the salt air and humid environment of Lukeyup. The transportation of the 2,230 glass plate negatives from a cedar chest in Joachim de Broom's study, where they've been stored for years, to the museum in Majerot, and the subsequent cleaning, storage, and development into prints to be indexed, documented, and displayed, has proven to be a task of monumental proportions. With funding provided by the Institute of Museum Services, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the South Pacific Commission in Noumea, New Caledonia, specialists Lynn Davis and Mary Lee from the Bishop Museum in Honolulu were brought in to make long-term recommendations for preserving the De Broom collection of glass plate negatives, documents, and artifacts. As another cultural conservation effort, Alele organizes and sponsors a festival of traditional dance and singing groups, participating in the annual Lutok Koban Alele Festival, which is spread out over a week in late August. Many government ministries, as well as privately organized groups, prepare programs for the week-long festival. Many youth groups also participate, ensuring that these activities are not seen as an activity only for older people. An air of friendly competition among the dance groups underlies this island-wide event. During the 1989 festival, Alele launched one of the largest outrigger sailing canoes to be produced in Majerot in several decades. The canoe construction, sponsored by the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, was the first in a series of research projects related to Alele's One Island Cane project, which is attempting to document the traditional outrigger styles and construction techniques for future generations of boat builders. The servicing of the sizable international market of stamp collectors is blossoming into a substantial revenue-generating project for Alele. The purpose of Alele's philatelic project is to reintroduce traditional, customary terminologies back into the cultural history of the nation through artistic rendition. Alele produces a first-day cover for each commemorative stamp issue depicting a cultural theme printed on the envelopes and an insert card describing the cultural term to the outside world in English. The designs and cultural terms are then printed on T-shirts, which are sold in the museum's gift shop. This is another profitable way we have found to enhance our cultural preservation program. Ultimately, we plan to utilize these artistic renderings as illustrations in an elementary school language arts text. In a further attempt to preserve, strengthen, and edify Kajimajal the native language, Alele has been involved in teaching the language and encouraging foreign workers to use it as much as possible. In 1987, under contract with Peace Corps marshals, Alele staff produced a complete training curriculum in Cajun Martial. The new curriculum is now used for language instruction for all new Peace Corps volunteers. Since it is broader than the earlier curricula used, it better equips these volunteers with the language skills and cultural understanding they need to develop close working relationships with Marshall Islanders in the many small communities in which they live. This new curriculum also serves as the basis for the evening language classes Alele offers to the Major expatriate community. Ultimately, Alele hopes to produce a Cajun Martial grammar, which can be used in secondary schools as a textbook. To further emphasize the written use of the language, Resource Protection Officer Alfred Capelli has launched a weekly column, Pitek Pain Labubu Lenajima, which means literally to use the arms of your grandmother and grandfather as a pillow, in the weekly Marshall Islands Journal newspaper that presents a group of older, more traditional words not used as frequently today as in earlier years. As the corporation's Resource Protection Officer, Alfred has administrative authority to review construction projects for cultural and historical site compliance, and works closely with the Marshall Islands Environmental Protection Authority to assess EPA permit requests. Alfred reports his findings to the cabinet-appointed Marshall Islands Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. In fulfilling these responsibilities, Alfred can now rely on staff archaeologist Dirk Spenneman, who came aboard in 1989, under a grant provided by the U.S. Office of Territorial and International Affairs. Dirk is currently training Alele staff in archaeological monitoring and survey techniques, and will soon be completing an archaeological survey and resource management report for Majuro Atoll. As Resource Protection Officer, Alfred also heads up the National Archives, which he launched during 1987 through Nidagella legislation. The government has provided strong support for this initiative, appropriating $40,000 for archival equipment and architectural plans for construction of the archives facility. The two-story structure will adjoin the museum library. When completed, it will also house a handicraft workshop and archaeology lab, as well as expanded museum exhibition and storage areas and library reading areas to accommodate the growing youth population. As an interim measure, until the addition to the museum library is built, the National Archives are located in the Pacific Room at the library and in the Alele 2 Annex, which was the former local government office building. The Alele 2 Annex was transferred to the Ministry of Interior and Outer Island Affairs from the Ministry of Education during 1987 and represents a further example of the Ministry of Education's growing support of Alele. The annex also houses Alele's video archives of oral histories and cultural events. The Pacific Room now houses over more than 2,000 rolls of microfilm, representing all of the over 2 million documents spanning its 40-year administration of Micronesia. These documents can now be viewed in the library's reader printer, which, along with other essential microfilming equipment, was also provided by a grant from the U.S. Office of Territorial and International Affairs. One of Alele's most recent projects involves a grant from the Marshall Islands Judiciary to begin microfilming the court's documents. 2 copies of these documents will be made, one for the Judiciary and another for the National Archives. We hope to have a computerized index of all these trust territory and judiciary documents accessible to the public during the coming year. Indeed, the years ahead should bring both further broadening and at the same time increased concentration of historic preservation efforts, including the further documenting, archiving, and expanded broadcasting of oral histories, the further identification, mapping, and photographing of historic landmarks as histories printed for use in the schools, the identification and mapping of the most significant archaeological sites, as well as continued monitoring of development projects for potential adverse effects upon these properties, with emphasis on cost-effective mitigation techniques, and to expand exhibitions and cultural activities at the Alele Museum Gallery and community center areas to make them a more attractive area for tourists as well as local visitors to come. Indeed, we have come a long way, but we're still planning carefully for the future. For it is only by maintaining our cultural heritage that we can truly prosper as a nation. Historic preservation can only be successful if concern for our cultural and historic resources rises from the grassroots up. Alele, with its broad membership of concerned citizens and its quasi-governmental non-profit status, shall continue to take every advantage of its unique position to seek innovative ways to merge public and private funding to conserve these resources, and in so doing, enhance the cultural evolution of our island nation.